everyone. This is Bill Lacey, director of the Dole Institute of Politics. Welcome again to our Dole virtual post-election conference. Our guest today is Francesca Chambers, who is the White House correspondent for McClatchy newspapers. Francesca graduated from KU and is a former member of our student advisory board, and we're delighted to have her here. So Francesca, thanks for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me. I recall when I was a student, you did one of these with Dan Bowles of the Washington Post, and it really was an influence on me. I still have the book that he signed from when I was at KU during that, so it's really a true honor to now be the one in the hot seat.
Yes, well, it's you'll think it's especially cool, Francesca, because Dan is part of this particular PEC as well. I just did an interview with him Friday, so now you're part of doing stuff with Dan Baltz. That's pretty cool.
Great. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. As I mentioned, Francesca, you're the White House correspondent. So let's go back to the beginning of the year. What was the mood in the White House and of the president about his reelection effort?
So much has changed this year because of the pandemic, Bill. Everything that we thought that we knew about presidential politics and how it's done was completely upended this year, including from a reporting standpoint, because no longer could you never could reporters, by the way, just walk into the White House chief of staff's office, for instance, but you couldn't just be around the White House all the time. You couldn't be at campaign rallies all the time. So at the end of last year, beginning of this year, when we were still able to go to those rallies, you would see major campaign officials walking around and they would just talk to reporters, gaggle as we call it on the record, and you really had a good sense in real time of what was going on. But once there was less travel and there was just less opportunity in general to be there in person, it completely changed how we had to go about things, and so many more of these discussions were taking place behind closed doors. So you had to get very good at getting behind those closed doors conversations and getting to what the president was telling his allies versus sometimes just having those conversations and being there in person yourself.
And what was the mood of the White House about the president's reelection chances?
Oh, they
Again,
felt they did. Yeah, they did. They felt very good about it. They felt very good about his reelection chances before coronavirus became a global pandemic, of course. But I was, just talking the other day in reflection on the election to a former campaign official who was telling me that as soon as coronavirus hit, though, this senior person knew that it was over for the president just immediately, because this person advised the president and said that, if you don't handle this correctly, this will be it for you. And as soon as this person on the campaign saying this felt that the president just did not respond early in the way that he needed to, they knew that this reelection effort for him was basically over beginning in about March, April time period, right after it became a global pandemic. So even from the beginning of the year to, the couple months, that was the fulcrum, right, of where everything sort of shifted beneath them. And then there were certainly different points where it seemed that Trump had come back in the race, even including after he got coronavirus himself. There was a time period where it really seemed like he could or would potentially be able to turn things around for himself. But of course, that didn't happen for various reasons I'm sure we'll get into.
Yes, well, so was it your sources' indication then that the pandemic was the main cause of the president's loss this year?
Yes, but more importantly, the president's response to the pandemic was the main source of the president's loss this year. And that's how you can go from feeling quite good about his reelection chances, just based on the things that they felt he had achieved. Their big slogan was promises made, promises kept. And so they were feeling very good about the unemployment record, for instance. One of the things he really played up, or the campaign tried to play up, was the lowest unemployment in history, and for various demographic groups like African Americans and Latinos women. They thought because of all those things, generally, right, the saying is that it's the economy, stupid, right? So they felt based on the economic numbers, even those, by the way, there was some concern about the economic numbers, of course, for many different people, and whether or not those would persist through the election. And of course, the pandemic also, caused those to really dive as well. However, at that time, that was the thinking at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, wow, there must have been an extraordinary change in the White House with the onset of both the coronavirus, but also with Joe Biden's win in South Carolina and his becoming the presumptive nominee. They had been looking at potentially facing Senator Sanders. And so all of a sudden, they've lost a potential great opponent to face, and then come to the coronavirus as well. So I found that a very fascinating insight. So thank you for sharing that with us. Any thoughts on how they could have handled it differently?
Sure, and I do want to say, when you're talking about who they thought they were going to face, there was long this talk of how, some of them said that they wanted to face Joe Biden, that they thought he would be the better candidate for them. But many of these folks were also telling me exactly what you just said, Bill, which is that Bernie Sanders was a better ready-made candidate for them, because they thought that they could attack him and say that he was a socialist and have more solid ground to stand on because he is a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. They thought that that would be an easy thing to peg on him and run against. If you compare that to Joe Biden, who had been a moderate, their biggest challenge there was trying to make him seem too far left, more progressive, and that he would be pulled in that direction. And so they did really try to do that in the election. They tried to say that, he would somehow be, at the feet of the left if he was elected, and there would be a bunch of leftists that would be around him, those sorts of things. But as we can see, again, that wasn't successful. And to your point, it might have been more successful if it had been someone else. As far as, what was your other question? Sorry.
The other question was, what do you think the president could have done differently to get more approval on his handling of the pandemic?
So what he could have done differently, according to his own advisors who were talking to me about this, and then you saw this too, is when he stopped doing those daily briefings with the White House press corps. Certainly we wanted more briefings. We wanted more briefings from senior officials, people who were on the coronavirus task force, to give us information about what was actually happening. But another turning point was the one of his last and perhaps most memorable briefings on this is the bleach day, right? The bleach, ingesting bleach day, where he didn't tell people to do that, but that is how it was, that is how it was interpreted widely, was that he had suggested somehow that people should indeed ingest bleach, which is very dangerous and people should not do, of course. But it was him saying that the disinfectant day was really the time. They had already been saying, stop when you're doing these briefings, going on and railing with your grievances and getting off topic, really let the doctors and the officials speak. And he had been going on, right? If you remember, for more than an hour. These were running up to 2 hours sometimes. And it wasn't so much that they were saying not to do them, they were just saying that he should be more disciplined in those briefings. But of course, after that day, because it was very disastrous for them, that was when we really stopped seeing him do them. Then in the fall, then he started to do more, because of course he came into a situation where, since he had just had coronavirus himself, then it became a situation again where people wanted to see him. They wanted to know that the president was okay. So they started putting him out there more again, and you saw him in those only take a few questions and leave the room, which is they had been encouraging him to do all along. But there was a lot of thought, Bill, that those early days, some of the things that he did and some of the things that he said from the podium were not helpful.
Sticking with the president and the White House, but moving to kind of a broader subject, I imagine that the refrain from various aides that he talked too much, he tweeted too much, his tone was a little bit harsh. I assume you have heard a lot of that over the last several years.
Yeah, that was pretty widespread. I think that what you really saw changing in the last couple weeks of the race, though, was that there were more people who were willing to voice frustration about what they called his grievance campaign and do it on the record. And you had heard, throughout the years, there had been many stories about people being frustrated. But what I found, at least in the last couple of weeks, is people who were coming out, like Chris Christie, Reince Priebus, other folks. There are many folks who I talked to too, who were saying these sorts of things in a public, on the record way, really trying to push the president to get on track, because they could see it in the numbers. They could feel it, that things were not going his way. And they really felt, this goes back to the economic message, that he really needed to push an economic message to explain to people how he would get the economy back on track, not just say that he would do it, right? Explain how he would do that. They felt that he needed to focus on those things more and on the grievances less. And he did, by the way. He did actually start, for a certain stretch of time there, focus on the grievance campaign less. He didn't spend as much time in his rallies, railing against the media, rallying against real and perceived political enemies. he did talk more about the economy, but there's also a question in some folks' mind of, even when he started to focus on that, whether it was too late because of all the other things that we talk about that had been happening all year long with coronavirus and himself having gotten it before, which really showed to his supporters that it was real. Even for folks who had been listening to him and thinking maybe this virus isn't as dangerous as I thought it was, partially because of the things the president was saying. When he got it himself, it was undeniable that if even the president of the United States could get it, that it was something that was real and they needed to be concerned about.
Okay, that's very interesting. I want to switch gears for a couple minutes and go to a different issue. At the end of May, George Floyd was killed by members of the Minneapolis police force. And we had a series of racial justice protests around the country. How do you think that affected the White House, and how did they react?
I think that it had a huge national effect. As far as the White House goes, so this bill, you raise an interesting point, because I've, in my own, conversations with people, have been trying to really retrace what happened with this particular issue. First, there was coronavirus, and that had a disproportionate effect on African-American community, the Latino community. And so in response to reporting on that, the White House starts announcing things like, we're gonna, the president is gonna have a whole task force just for this, a commission rather, and he's gonna, we're gonna be looking at this, we're gonna be doing something on this, and we'll let you know. And they had said that they were gonna get back to us by June, to let us know about this by June. They pull in Tim Scott, he pulls in the folks that had been working on his Opportunity Zone Council, he's got Ben Carson, working on this issue. Well, then, as you said, the death of George Floyd comes along, and in speaking to people who were involved in this really changed their thinking, because they had to go from one fire in the African-American community to this whole other issue that they now needed to solve as well. And so they shifted really their focus from the coronavirus and the disproportionate effects to really trying to focus on this issue. So Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, and by the way, one of only 3 Black senators in the US Senate and the only Republican, he really takes the lead on this because he had been working on it, by the way, for years before this policing reform. It's been an issue for him for many years. And he was tasked with writing the legislation for the US Senate for this. And so the Trump administration essentially got behind that, but they had some very big disagreements about that issue and with Congress, about some of the things that Congress wanted to do versus what they wanted to do. They didn't want there to be something that was called, there was a big fight over something that was called qualified immunity, regarding whether or not police officers should have certain levels of immunity from things. And there was a big fight over that, and that essentially, and a few other issues, just stopped anything from happening in the US Senate, period. And so there were just a lot of these issues, right? Then after that, you see it kind of because of the elections coming up, right? And you have the Republican National Convention, you have all the news that there was about that, about them needing to switch locations. It just sort of, after that, nothing happened. Nothing ever happened on the issue. And you go into the fall, and the Trump administration, or rather the Trump campaign, puts forward this platinum plan, is what the president called his plan for African Americans, this platinum plan that he wanted to move forward with if he got reelected. But they filled out, right, some of these ideas that they had wanted to do potentially for the African American community, but it wasn't really something that you saw him focus on in the general election. That was not clearly a big part of his message during the general election.
What were some of the things that you heard from White House people about the clearing of Lafayette Square and that, I guess, what I would call a photo opportunity at, I believe it was St. John's Church?
It was at St. John's Church, and call that day vividly because, of course, there was this split screen that people felt was very damaging for the president, and not just, his supporters, just generally. This was a widespread sort of reaction to it, of him delivering remarks in the Rose Garden on "There will be law and order," and then there were the smoke bombs that were going off in Lafayette Square at the same. There was a network that did a split screen of these two at the same time, and it was a bad look. It was optically not good. Then he walks over to St. John's. Then, of course, there was some division over that comes back later about Esper, the defense secretary. There was a lot of questions over how that happened, who was involved, why they were involved, and whether it was appropriate. And you know, Bill, it's hard in any election season to pinpoint one thing, right? And it does not seem that that wasn't the thing really that did the president in, so to speak. It was coronavirus, but you are right that there are a couple different things that happened there along the way that were difficult for him.
Okay, you mentioned the conventions just a few moments ago, Francesca. I'm curious, what was your overall assessment of the virtual conventions and how quickly the parties were able to adapt?
So I actually did a lot of reporting on the conventions, Bill, because one of the papers that McClatchy publishes is the Charlotte Observer, and it was originally supposed to be in Charlotte, the Republican one. Then they moved it to Florida when they were supposed to have it in Jacksonville, and we also published the Miami Herald. So it moved from one of our major markets really to another one of our major markets. So there were several weeks where really all I was doing sometimes it felt like was like breaking news on the conventions and what was under consideration for the Republican National Convention. And so, you know, the one thing that Democrats had going for them in the convention the virtual convention they put together was that they called it a lot sooner than Republicans did. They knew that they weren't going to be able to have a large gathering of that size, and they prepared for months. Whereas Republicans were, of course, starting to toss around the idea that it might not be able to happen, but they did not want to move in that virtual direction. So even as they were privately talking about it, you know, it wasn't something that they were aggressively moving forward with. Then they end up being put in a position where they didn't have a choice but to call it off, and had very little amount of time to be able to put together something that was more virtual. Then you also had that event that was on the White House South Lawn, which I don't like to use the word unprecedented, Bill, right? I think it's overused, but it was unprecedented to have a Republican convention, a president, you know, deliver an acceptance speech on the White House South Lawn, particularly given what was happening with coronavirus at the time. And I was there, I was personally there, and there were many people wearing masks, there wasn't social distancing. And so this really, again, see, it wasn't the convention that was the problem, but it all feeds back into this narrative that we've been discussing the whole time about the coronavirus and things that the president maybe could have done differently to show that he was taking it seriously.
Right. How would you, after the conventions, how would you describe the mood in the White House about the president's reelection possibility, and kind of what were the main components of his fall strategy?
So they felt that they got their message across well in the convention. And, you know, one thing they did go out of their way to do, which touches on what we were talking about before about his outreach to the minority communities, was they really tried to highlight voices in the minority communities, you know, making sure that Tim Scott and some other folks, you know, had really prominent speaking roles at that convention. So they felt they walked away from it feeling right, especially with the amount of time they had to put it on together, that they did well with it. But this then leads back into the point where, you know, the president, so first of all, RBG ends up dying, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That was another point this fall that I think was a real turning point, where it went from, they always say after Labor Day is when people start paying attention to presidential politics, right? People, the average person, not you and me because we're obsessed, but the average person. And it didn't feel so much like that after this, right after the conventions is another time, or right after Labor Day, because we were in a pandemic, everything was virtual. It was just an unusual situation. But then with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that's when it felt like everything really turned into gear, turned on a dime. The Trump folks felt like they had something positive to message, a Supreme Court appointment. That was something that he had really stressed to conservatives in 2016 when he was trying to get elected, for people who were wary of him for various reasons, was that, look, you put me in office and I will make judicial appointments. And so that is another thing he had stressed in the campaign, was how many judicial appointment slots he had filled, and, you know, along with the help of Mitch McConnell in the Senate. So they felt like they had something positive then, right, to put people's focus on that wasn't coronavirus, that they could campaign on, which was that he was able to appoint his third Supreme Court justice. But again, it was immediately after that in which people at the White House started coming down with coronavirus, including the president, because there had been that event in the Rose Garden to their celebration, is what they called it, a celebration of Amy Coney Barrett having been appointed. So it then became, even the Supreme Court nominee gets tangled up in coronavirus and stories about that, which was right, not the news coverage that they had wanted of their Supreme Court nomination, was then to have what was dubbed a super spreader event by health officials, including those who worked for his own government, and have all of these news stories after that about official after official after official in the White House and on his campaign coming down with coronavirus, including himself and the First Lady, and then, as we know later, their son.
Well, Francesca, that's a very good point about the passing of Justice Ginsburg. I was going to ask about that. But about 3 days before that, something else happened that I wanted to get your thoughts on. That was Bob Woodward's book, A Rage, was published. What was the reaction inside the White House to that book?
That one was a little bit different than his previous books because, as Woodward had said, he had tapes of his interviews with the president in which the president had downplayed the coronavirus. And so it wasn't as if there are a couple types of stories, you can run down in the White House. Sometimes it's, as I said before, is the president called up allies and told them something. It's another thing if the president is personally, you've got him, a video of him or a call of him saying these things. It makes it much harder for them to be able to run away from that sort of story. And that's exactly what Bob Woodward had. So again, another inflection point in playing back into the coronavirus and whether or not he took it seriously enough, whether the White House did enough about it. And by the way, there is a huge difference between whether the coronavirus task force itself, which was working behind closed doors, was doing enough. And sometimes I think what the public saw, because when the president was getting up there and not always those officials, right, and answering the questions instead of those health officials, I think it did give off a perception broadly, nationally, right, that it was perhaps being mishandled, even if government officials and the task force itself were hard at work talking to governors or whatever else they may have been doing.
Then we went into, later in September, you had a really tough week for the president, which started with the New York Times disclosure that paid income taxes in a while, significant income taxes, I should say, and also covering information on his financial resources. How was that received?
Because of the focus on his taxes, his tax returns in the last presidential election, and the various things we've seen over the years, right, from Rachel Maddow's reporting and other reporting the New York Times had done, I do not want to take away from that because that was a huge scoop for the New York Times. It really, really was. I just think, as we're talking about some of these things, Bill, and you're talking about, and then 3 days later, and then 2 days later, and I'm reliving all this. I'm like, oh, I guess, was that really like 2 days later? There was so much that was happening, right? As if, the way you're describing it, it's true. There was just this like bad news after bad news after bad news for the White House and the president, and all of that. It's hard sometimes for me when I look back to see how many things stood out, even if they were really big news for a day or a couple days, because then something else they might have been a bigger thing, except for something else that ends up happening that was not great for the president or the White House. And then everyone's, focus would just shift to whatever that next thing was.
Yeah, well, you say a lot of really big things happening. You're absolutely right. That week started with the New York Times story. Then you had the first debate. What was your reaction to the first debate?
Well, the reaction to the first debate, at least among the president's allies and particularly Republicans, the allies, that's when they started to speak out more, as I was saying before, speak out more about how they felt that he needed to shift his message. It was absolutely after the first debate and the way that he went after Biden, a moment that was, that he thought would be helpful in that debate, for instance, that probably didn't pan out the way he wanted to, was when he was talking about Biden's son and made a little bit of a big mess up there when he was talking about him, and it ended up being not Hunter, but his deceased son, Beau. Just everything else about that debate aside, there was that too. And so then you take the fact that the way that he kept coming after Biden, they just did not think that it was generally perceived as a good performance. And Republicans were starting to get very nervous about that, advising him not to take the same approach. Well, you mentioned the debates. You recall, because he had coronavirus, they did not end up having the second debate. The vice presidential debate took place, but his second debate didn't take place. He ends up doing that forum with Savannah Guthrie instead. And that was very combative at the beginning when she was interviewing him. And by the way, really sticking to him a lot of those questions that she did, because this is around the time, as I was describing, when they stopped putting him in front of reporters again, because they didn't want him getting question after question about, coronavirus, but also we couldn't be in front of him for a number of days there because he had coronavirus. We could not be in front of him to ask him questions. And so that's really the first time that you see him drilled about coronavirus and what was going on and having had it. And that was also just not a great interview for him. The way he answered the questions, he got very frustrated and angry. So you get to the third debate, which the third actual debate, not his third debate against Biden, because the second debate against Biden didn't take place. You get to that last, his final debate, and they thought that he did better in that debate, that his performance was much better. And I recall watching some of the focus groups that were being conducted on these, and people felt like he did much better in that debate, but the question was too little too late, because early vote and absentee. And this was something we were really trying to struggle with at the time, which was whether or not it was too late for him. It was what a lot of us were asking sources that week. And you couldn't know until election day. And I think when you look at the absentee ballots and the mail-in ballots, that's exactly what happened, is it was too late. People had already voted for Joe Biden by mail, by absentee, after the first debate performance, because in some states they were voting, in September already. So or at least they were sending out ballots already at that point. And so people had already voted in some of these key swing states, and it didn't really matter then by the time you got to the third debate. And the Trump folks have been trying to move the debates up because they start to realize at some point that this mail-in voting thing is a problem for them. But again, too little, too late.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on this, Francesca. So the president's first debate was, I think most people would agree, pretty much a disaster. The second debate that the two presidential candidates were in was far better. What changed in the president's mind that would cause him to take that vastly different approach in that second and last debate?
He did seem to be listening to Republicans and his advisors during that time period who were telling him that this is not working. You need to change your approach. He really did. It might not have been, perceptible maybe to everyone in the broader public, but it did, for someone who's watching this day in, day out, seem that he was taking the advice of more so of these senior Republicans. And by the way, I had folks telling me that they knew that he was never going to drop the grievances and he was never going to drop his style, nor did they really want him to, because that's what got him elected in the first place. But that they did feel that it was detracting from him and really wanted him to start mixing it up with, some grievances and then also more of the economy. And I did notice him, really start to do that. Even when he was railing against Hunter Biden at some of those rallies, he was talking a lot more about the economy, is what I'm saying, than he had been talking about prior to that point.
Okay. Overall, do you think that, so overall the debates were a big minus for the president? Your basic.
Not the last one. No, not the last one. He did two debates. He did two. The first one, minus. The second one, plus. But the first one happened so early, not so early. It happened as early as it traditionally does. I'm just saying it happened based on the fact that there wasn't a middle one. You see what I'm saying? There wasn't that second debate. He didn't get a chance to recuperate fast enough in the race. And again, that the debate didn't happen because he had coronavirus recently before it. But no, the first one minus, the third one plus, and he probably would have benefited from having had another one in there.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, but Bill, I would just say that he had the Savannah Guthrie thing instead. So in the night where it would have ban, so who knows?
Yes. Well, I want to go back to the president's positive test for COVID and the reaction of the White House. I mean, you got to do something that a lot of White House correspondents don't get to do, which is cover a president during a health crisis. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had anything like that before. I just want to get your thoughts. How did that feel? How did your sources talk to you about it? How did they keep you informed? How do you think the White House handled that overall?
That was a time when we were blanketing our sources, more than we thought that we had really worked hard during the Supreme Court nomination. And then of course, you get to the following weekend and this is all happening, it's probably, during the election, I think that was the height, in terms of like literally working around the clock, never having any moments break, right? Because everyone was trying to find out what was going on with the president, really talking about getting in the room. There were only a couple people in the room with him. It was Mark Meadows and then Dan Scavino. So the White House Chief of Staff, his social media director, there are maybe a few people who are speaking to him on the phone, right? And you're really trying to find out what is going on with the president once he's in the hospital. And I was actually at Walter Reed. I was in the pool that went ahead to Walter Reed before he went to Walter Reed. So the way this works with the pool reporters, for folks who aren't, familiar with this, there are people who travel with the president everywhere, and we rotate. So print organizations, there's a separate one for radio, TV. We rotate through our turns. And the regular person was at the White House. And so I was deployed ahead to go to Walter Reed to be one of the reporters who would be there to receive him, when Marine One landed. And so, Bill, that is so stressful, right? Like, now looking back on that, is such a stressful situation to have a president of the United States who's going to be put in a hospital because he is now he's now contracted the coronavirus. And that was, when you're talking about the people around him, because so many people around him also had coronavirus, that also made it really challenging from a reporting perspective, because so many people who were senior officials who you could otherwise talk to or call or in his orbit were also coming down with coronavirus. Like Chris Christie ends up going into the hospital, as well. That also made it difficult. And in terms of getting information, it made it difficult because the White House itself, people had to go into quarantine because they had been in close contact with other people who had coronavirus. There's also a news judgment to be made about whether or not, as a reporter or your company as a reporter, once you at the White House, where there is a coronavirus outbreak, where person after person is getting it, there's a real question of safety there. And so you couldn't, even more so, right? What I'm saying, during the pandemic, you couldn't be at the White House every day. That was really a time where you didn't want to be at the White House every day. But then, trying to figure out, is if you can't get a hold of someone, is it because they have coronavirus? Is it because they're just not responding? Are they in quarantine? What's going on here? And I don't know. I don't know when, in at least not in my career, when I've ever had a situation like that, and where there will be another one like that.
I hope you don't have. I hope you work as a White House correspondent a long time and you don't have another one like that. But
me too. And I didn't want to draw attention to my age, Bill. I didn't want to draw attention to my age. I do hope I have many years in front of me as a White House correspondent. And I will be covering the Biden administration, by the way. So at least 4 more.
That's great. That's great. That's awesome. Let me ask you this: the president-elect went into election day with what most thought was about an 8 or 9 percentage point national lead, fairly comfortable leads in some of the states. What was the White House mood going into election day? Were they in disbelief about the polls and thinking that 2016 was going to repeat itself, or were they very concerned?
No, they were in disbelief. And I had the president's daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, who was a senior advisor to his campaign, telling me on the record that they felt, and Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chairwoman, telling me that they felt like this was 2016 again, that the polls were going to be wrong again. And to their point, right? Like, the polls were wrong again, and that he did get more votes than he got in 2016. Like, those things did end up happening for them. So I can see how they were feeling based on the fact that they were campaigning. If you recall, Joe Biden was not having in-person events because they were concerned about the spread of coronavirus. The Trump campaign was doing 2 bus tours around the country in addition to the president's rallies. And so they were doing bus tours, and these bus tours were stopping at their RNC offices, which are joint with the Trump campaign, and they're trying to fire up volunteers. And they just felt like, from what they were seeing on the ground, that this was going to go well for the president. And, this goes back to the reporting and how it was different. Because I at least couldn't be on the ground in the same way that I had been on the ground in 2016, then it's harder. It's much harder to judge, right, what's actually happening, what the actual sentiment is in this race. It was, you didn't know as much, right? Because I wasn't there at the rallies talking to people in person. And certainly there are downsides to those things too. I mean, if you're at the rallies and you're only talking to Trump supporters or Biden supporters, of course they're going to say great things about him. I get that. And when I was full time on Hillary Clinton's campaign plane as an embed, of course, you're just in the bubble then. And so again, you're only hearing from one side frequently. So you start to think a certain thing based on that. But it still was, they felt, because they were out there on the ground, they were having one experience, and so they felt very good about it. And I do think it was challenging, at least for me, to assess that based on the fact that I wasn't at those rallies and I wasn't on the ground, and I was really relying on the sources I could call in those places, in those swing states, to tell me what they thought was happening.
Do you know where the strategy to claim fraud and that the president had been reelected but was cheated out, where did that come from, and how was that viewed inside the White House?
So that has been something that he had been really gearing up for. You could see it beginning the whole time. He had said months and months ago, right, that if he didn't win, then it was because it would be stolen from him and it would be unfair. I mean, he really started to push that way before that, before the election was ever actually held. So I don't think it was really much of a surprise that that was what he claimed once the election took place. The reaction that I've heard from various different folks, Republicans, allies of his, those sorts of folks, is a couple things. One is the mail-in situation. There are Republicans who clearly felt even then that him railing against mail-in voting was a mistake because Democrats were doing it and it was discouraging Republicans from doing it. And then you have to rely on a big election day turnout. Now, the Trump folks thought that they were going to have a massive election day turnout that would make up the difference for the early vote surge that Democrats had. They did have a large election day turnout, right? The president, again, did actually win more votes than he did in 2016, but it wasn't enough to make up for that early lead that Democrats had in key swing states through the mail-in voting. So even when all that was going on before the votes were counted, there were Republicans who were close to the White House telling me that they thought that that was a mistake, that they were very concerned about it. And certainly now, I actually just put out a story about how in the Georgia runoff elections, by the way, this is something that Republicans are working to counteract. They are really encouraging people to vote early in person. They are, vote by mail. They know that over the holidays, that's a problem for them. They believe that people will get sidetracked by the holidays, right? And then interest will potentially taper off in this January 5th runoff election. So they were trying to learn a lesson from the presidential race, really, and that's a big part of this. But then, you also have the other stream of folks here, which do not think that the president is being served well by Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis, who are leading this legal strategy that you talked about, and they've told him that. It's now at the point, sort of like with the grievance campaign, right? It's sort of at the point now where you're hearing this vocally from allies of the president who are saying he's not being served well by his legal team, particularly, and this is why it's so important with Georgia, it all ties in because they're very concerned that there will not be faith in the election, and Republicans in Georgia will not come out and vote in this runoff election for their two Republican candidates. So you've now seen people, Republicans close to the president, even being more vocal and speaking out against that. Because if you're a Republican and you believe that there was widespread fraud, which I have to assert, there is no evidence of widespread fraud. But if you believe that because the president's saying that, and then you don't come out and vote in those Senate elections, then Republicans lose control of the Senate.
I think that's a very legitimate concern and something I've talked to a number of our guests about. We've got a little bit over a month left of the Trump administration. How does it play out over the next month? Do you think we'll see the president do anything with new initiatives? There's been discussion about putting some of his loyalists in place. Do you think there will be any kind of a concession?
There seems to be a situation that he's at least considering about pardoning more people, of course. There are many things that he could try and do, and we've seen him do by executive order. He's trying, he's been pushing out more executive orders as it gets closer and closer to January 20th. He has obviously spent a lot of his time recently focused on the election results. Now that the Electoral College will have voted, I think that's the key question is, does he now move on from this and start worrying more about his legacy than he had been worried about? Or does he continue to channel his energy towards these election challenges that have been failing in court? And that's what's really unclear. And people even close to him don't know what he will choose to do. that's always been the thing in this administration, by the way. No matter how many times we try to report beforehand what the president's thinking or doing, is that people constantly, some people might write 3 people. You could even have 3 sources telling you he's thinking about one thing, and then maybe he's on the phone with someone else and then changed his mind. Like, and that's always been the real difficulty of covering this administration. So it's hard for me to say what he'll do in the next month. It's hard for me to say what he'll do in the next day.
No, I can understand that for sure. Do you think at the end of the day that his lack of message discipline was a real problem for his reelection and for the White House?
You know, his allies, again, really would have wanted him to have been more disciplined in his messaging. The rallies I was hearing from Republicans, though, they felt like weren't for the average American. They were for his supporters to try and get them to come out and vote for him and really get them excited. And again, based on the vote turnout, his supporters did seem, you know, to be excited, and they came out for him. He just didn't seem to win over enough of the folks he had either converted from the last election, you know, blue collar folks, particularly if you look in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, who maybe swung the other way or didn't get out and vote the first time and came out the second time for a Democrat in 2020. And so you talk about message discipline. Is it that it was, you know, not enough message discipline in rallies that they may not have been watching anyway if it wasn't, you know, in their state? There were some Republicans who told me that that's how they kind of felt about the rallies and what you're saying, which, by the way, is different than those national coronavirus briefings that were taking place at the White House from the podium, because those were something that everyone was watching, especially early on when that was the only place you could get your news about what was happening with this virus. That was so that's why I go back to those days, especially being ones that seemed to cause the most problems for him as they went along. They started out early a lot, right, focusing on the scientists are talking, and then it got more and more to be just him talking and the scientists not really talking at all, and Deborah Birx just sitting there and Fauci not even there, and that's where he seemed to get himself in trouble.
Okay, is it fair then to say that your thought is that essentially his handling of the pandemic is probably the greatest factor in his defeat?
Yes, that's exactly it, and not just based on, you know, my personal opinion, which I'm glad you like my personal opinion, but really based on sourcing what I was told all along the way, and even after the election from people who were close to him.
Okay, I have a few more questions, but I want to shift gears to the new person you're going to be covering, President-elect Biden. Do you feel that he, despite the Democrats not taking the Senate they expected to pick up, and they still could take the Senate, as you point out, depending upon Georgia, they did not pick up seats in the House that they expected. Do you think the president-elect will be inaugurated with a mandate?
You know, when you talk about the House and the Senate, that was, by the way, and I wrote about this, what I called like the bright spot. It was the one bright spot for Republicans in this election after losing the presidential, was that they were expecting to be beat at the state level in the state houses, and that didn't happen in the House, and they picked up seats instead. In the Senate, where they you know, only lost a couple seats, they thought that they were just doomed in the Senate. And it didn't end up happening for them. And so it does create, for Biden's team, sure, it creates difficulty just we're seeing right now in terms of nominations. He can't put forward the same kind of people, you know, that he might have necessarily wanted to, people who were more progressive potentially in these positions. He can't pick people who might be perceived as many people as controversial. You can have a couple controversial picks, but you know, you can't have too many of them when you don't even control the Senate. So even if Democrats, by the way, win those 2 Georgia runoff elections, this is really important for people to understand how this actually works. It would just put it at 50-50. And then the reason Democrats would quote unquote control the Senate is because Biden won the presidency, Kamala Harris would be the deciding vote as president of the Senate. Vice president is president of the Senate. So that doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room on anything. And there's still a 60 vote threshold in the Senate for many different things because of the filibuster. There's not for judicial nominations, and there certainly won't be for the cabinet. But that presents a problem. And Barack Obama, the former president, he's the one who maybe put that best when he was saying to Georgia voters during a recent event that the Biden administration's entire legacy or something to that effect, you know, I don't know what the exact words were, are on the line in the Georgia Senate races. And, you know, really putting it out there that this could be decided before Biden ever is inaugurated, right? Whether or not he can get many of the things done that he wants to get done.
Okay. How do you think the president-elect will handle the tension in his party between progressives and the establishment?
Right now, we've seen him handle any kind of tension in the party by, it appears to be often getting jerked one way and then jerked another. If he's getting pushed to have more up and comers, right? Then he'll nominate some, you know, that day you'll hear someone who's look, here's a younger up and comer that we have. If it's that they're not diverse enough, it's all of a sudden that day, look, we have a diverse candidate that we've just nominated for that. It's very reactionary. That's reactionary, it seems, at this point, as groups that were very important to him getting elected. By the way, all these various groups were important to him getting elected. They start to make demands. You've seen that you've actually seen people come out and say, right, like, I got you elected. Now I expect you to fulfill the promises that you made to us. And that's going to be an ongoing tension in the Biden administration between all the various constituencies of, you know, people and groups he either promised things to, or maybe he didn't promise things outright to them, right? But they feel that they're owed something because they helped to get him elected. And how do you fulfill all those competing demands?
Okay. It's going to be very interesting to watch, I think. What, to you personally, is the most exciting about getting the opportunity to cover a new president?
Well, inaugurations are always fun, regardless of whether it's a new or returning. I mean, those only happen every 4 years. And so you're lucky to get one on the White House beat. I've got one when it was President Trump, and I'll get another one with President Biden. We also expect that the inauguration won't look like what it has looked like in the past as well. But I think the inaugurations, right, that's always, since it only happens every 4 years, I think that the inaugurations are always really fun and really interesting. And, you know, there's always a parade and those sorts of things. Long term, you know, it's both exciting and I'll admit it's a little bit challenging when you know you're going to switch administrations as a reporter and what you have to cover, because all of it, you know, you go from me having reported on this one administration for the last 4 years. And of course, I was actually covering Democrats who ran during the presidential election before I got to McClatchy. So I wasn't just covering the Trump White House Republicans. I was also covering Kamala Harris. I was also covering Cory Booker. I was covering Bernie Sanders, those sorts of things, and Joe Biden. So you don't come in with nothing, come in with something, but it's definitely a different shift of the mind, right? Even some of the issues that you have to really think about every day that you're going to cover. With the Trump folks, they had their own set of issues that Republicans and conservatives really care about. And Democrats have a very different set of issues that they often really care about. And starting to think about those, starting to think about building up your sourcing. Again, not entirely from scratch, but the new administration is from scratch, right? So you have to build up the whole beat almost from scratch again. What helps is that I've been covering the White House, for instance, for 6 years. So 2 under Obama, 4 under Trump. And that helps, right? Because I've seen an administration switch. I know what that's like. I know how to cover the White House and how all these processes work, and the agencies stay the same. And even government officials in some of those agencies stay the same, right? It's only the political appointees that change. So folks like Anthony Fauci, we already know will still be there. So there is some people who hold on, but I think this is a critical time period, even if you're a reporter, for trying to shift gears about the party that's in power. And even if you cover Congress too, by the way, you know, it's the whole town. You have to really shift gears about the party that's in power.
Are you looking forward to being able to function as normally you function over the last few years, getting out of this pandemic and what it's imposed upon the way that you do your job?
Yes, but I will also say that it taught me some really key lessons as a reporter, or reminded me rather of some key lessons as a reporter when I was talking about, you know, calling folks and having to rely on them to tell you what is going on in their community isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because it really did force me to speak to more community leaders, whether they were, you know, groups close to the White House or church, you know, faith-based leaders, or, you know, various party chairs even, you know, at the county level, in a way that if at least last cycle in 2016, when again, I was, able to be on a campaign plane the whole time, that I wasn't really able to do. And that was, in many ways, getting back to those basics was helpful. But certainly, of course, I miss being able to do some of the things we were able to do, like foreign travel with the president was obviously something that's been nixed over the past year. And those, you put up with a lot of the grind so that you can get to be there, for instance, like I was when the president met the new Japanese emperor, and he was the first foreign leader to do that. That was very cool. And of course, we miss things like that. But more importantly, Bill, and I think everyone feels this way, I'm excited for the pandemic to be over because of the intense loss of life that we are seeing every single day right now. It just makes it so hard, for everyone. And I'll be grateful when that's over for that reason.
Francesca Chambers is the White House correspondent for McClatchy, former KU student, member of the Dole SAB. We really appreciate your joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill, for having me. And again, it's been a real honor, particularly to be someone from Kansas, landlocked, might I add, to get to have this job that I have now with McClatchy, which I always remind folks that we published the Wichita Eagle and the Kansas City Star, but it's been a true honor for me, who grew up in a very small town in Kansas, to be able to get to have the job that I have, to be able to be in a front row seat of history has been tremendous. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
You bet, and enjoy the next 4 years. Thank you very much, Francesca. Thanks to everyone who viewed this interview. We really appreciate your support of the Dole Institute. Thanks for joining us for the virtual Dole post-election conference, and have a good day.